Hi, everybody. My name is Matthew Poes with Audioholics, and today we're going to be doing a little overview and measurement report on the Sony STR-AZ7000ES. All right, so let's talk about this Sony flagship receiver. So this thing has 13 channels of amplification. It's rated at 140 watts into 8 ohms at 0.09% total harmonic distortion with 2 channels driven. Can it really do that? Well, we're going to find out. It's got Dolby Atmos and DTSX as well as DTSX Pro. It's got IMAX Enhanced, and then it also has some proprietary Sony features like Digital Cinema Auto Calibration 9 or IX, and 360 spatial sound mapping calibrate. So the first one is basically how it calibrates in terms of like EQ, speaker level setting, kind of the typical stuff we see, but it uses this interesting stereo microphone. And that stereo microphone allows it to do what it's referring to as 3D spatial mapping. I don't actually know what that means. And why I say that is I'm not 100% sure how it works or what it does, but it sure sounds an awful lot like the Trinnov altitude processors, like the 16 and the 32. And if so, this would be by far the cheapest way to get into that kind of capability. So that's pretty cool. It's got Sony's DSEE, I'm calling it an upsampler. Basically, it's just their way of improving standard resolution audio to make it sound more like HD. Does it do anything useful or improve sound? Probably not, but you know, that's the feature it has, and it's ubiquitous. Most receivers have some version of this. It's got a new 32-bit DAC. They don't specify what it is. Premium components and ES build quality, and I can say with my hands on time, it definitely is a premium, well-built receiver, very comparable to other products in its price range. I was a little bit worried at first that there wasn't an app to go along with it because there wasn't anything called like Sony Receiver app. But it turns out the Music Center app, which is sort of a way of connecting all of their smart devices together, is the way that you control the receiver. And then it's compatible with Sony's own wireless speakers. So Sony has kind of their version of like the Denon Marantz HEOS type system or Sonos type system. In terms of additional specs beyond that, it also has Chromecast, Google Assistant, Spotify Connect, Apple AirPlay 2, which I love, Bluetooth. It's Sonos port compatible. It has Roon. It has a 3-room, 3-source multi-zone capability built into it, which is pretty nice. A lot of flagship processors typically still only have 2. For that matter, Trinnov doesn't have any. So it's nice that they've thrown that in. It has actually HDMI dual zone switching. So what that means is you can send different sources to different zones, even in terms of HDMI. Again, not unheard of in high-end receivers, but it's nice that they've done that. It's got powered stereo output capability for zone 2, although keep in mind you're going to be using up 2 of those 13 channels if you do that, and analog output for zone 2 and 3. So you can use external amplification. It's got HDMI 2.1. It has 7 ins and 2 outs with 1 front input. However, only 4 of the HDMI inputs are 8K, and then both outputs are 8K. And what that means is that the other 3 are 4K. It does have HDCP 2.3. It supports HDR10, Dolby Vision, HLG, and IMAX Enhanced. It has gaming optimized video processing, supports variable refresh rate and auto low latency modes. It does support ARC and eARC. And then there's a 13-channel preamp output with fixed outputs for the front LCR surround, left-right, back surround, left-right, and then heights 1 through 3. By fixed, I mean you can't reassign those to something else. So if you don't want 3 outputs, 3 height, not output, but 3 height channels, for instance, and you'd rather use those for extra subwoofer outputs, it's not an option. And that's always a feature that we like when they do allow reassignment like that. But again, this is actually very common that they don't allow such things. Now, there's some really cool new processing on the Sony, and I'm really excited that they've actually added these features. So they have something they refer to as center channel enhancement. I'm sorry, I'm calling it center channel enhancement. They call it center channel speaker lift up, Bravia acoustic center sync, and dual center speaker. So how does this work? Well, it goes back to that 360 remapping capabilities. A lot of Sony Bravia TVs actually have sound transducers that utilize the entire screen surface as a speaker. This will actually sync in so that you could use the TV screen as either your only center channel or as a center channel lift up. So it wouldn't be sending all of the center channel information, but just some coded information designed to help lift up the perception of the image. I think that's actually a really good idea. If you're using a TV, you almost always have to have the center channel in the wrong location, either above or below. I haven't used it yet, so I can't tell you how good it is, but I do have a Sony Bravia TV with this capability. So I'm going to be testing this out because my center channel is actually over the TV. And whether over or under, it was audible. And so I decided to kind of leave it as is. And yeah, under a lot of conditions, you don't notice it, but there are a lot of conditions where you do. So I'm curious to see how this works. My concern would always be, can the Sony TV transducers actually sound good enough to really get the job done? So then we also have the dual center speaker idea. That can be problematic when you're just paralleling outputs. I'm hoping Sony's doing some processing and using more of a lift-up approach. Often what you do is one of them is sort of your standard. So usually the lower one is sort of your standard main center. The one above is like a lift-up center, and it actually gets what's referred to as a darkened signal. And the darkened signal helps to give the perception of a raised center image without actually creating the comb filtering and other problems you get. It's got an intuitive on-screen display, as they put it. A lot of high-end processors don't even have an on-screen display. So again, always nice to see that. Built-in support for C4, Crestron, Savant, and others. So they are really billing this. This and the RS-232C and remote IR connectors, the 3 12-watt triggers, all of this is trying to make this basically a better product for integrators. And having talked to my friend Don Dunn, I mean, they had not been big on Sony receivers in the past and got pretty excited just because these really are integrator-centric and it's nice. Got a 5-year warranty and it weighs 48 pounds, which means it's a bit of a beast of a receiver. Yes, it's not as heavy as the other flagship receivers we've tested from some other companies, but you got to remember it is up there with some of the heaviest, and those that are heavier are typically even more expensive yet, $5,000, $6,000. This is not that expensive. Integrator-centric design. It's got inclusion of oversee. So in addition to all the integration capabilities I mentioned with Crestron, Control4, and Savant, it also has oversee capabilities, which basically allows you to monitor this thing remotely and do things like power cycling. It's a really nice feature and really great for integrators. It also has some DSP features that I already talked about, which I think are great problem solvers. So it's not uncommon to be stuck in a situation where you have to install the speakers in a place in a way that's not ideal. My own family room is a great example of that. And so the fact that they've gone ahead and set this up in such a way where the ability to remap the center channel to the TV or to dual centers and to do this lift up feature, I think is actually really great. I'm really excited that they've done that. Now, the next thing I'm going to start to get into is the measurements. So I did that you'll have to excuse it. It's a little tricky with my particular audio analyzer. It's the Quantum Asylum QA401 to get everything exactly like to 1 watt output, but an extra quarter watt doesn't make a big difference, doesn't really affect these measurements. And so it's not exactly 1 watt. You'll see that, but I did 1.23 watts. It was intended to be a 1 watt measurement with an 8 ohm load. I used a very good quality planar resistor. So that the signal to noise ratio that I measured with 1 watt was 91.5 dB. And that's A weighted, although I will say that the A weighting versus no weighting didn't make much of a difference at all. Then the THD plus noise was minus 82 dBs or 0.00782%. It's not bad. It's not great. That was with a speaker load. We would like to typically see a better, that basically equates to you can just get rid of the negative sign. That's your SYNAD value. So 82 dBs of SYNAD is okay. Excuse me, it's kind of average at best. And I did try a higher wattage to see if we were in the noise maybe. So I tried 5 watts and it didn't improve it at all. So the best noise performance I was able to get from the amp is not max output, but was pretty close. It was 109 watts. And that got me 84 dB SYNAD, a 94 dB signal to noise ratio. So then I did do power sweeps. Now, I said the amp was rated for 140 watts per channel, 2 channels driven. So I did some 2 watt power sweeps. Now, depending on how you define this, you can come up with different power levels. But basically, the knee, which I'm defining as the point at which the power, if you look at this is a sweep of power over, distortion over power. And as the power goes up, what you see is that it kind of falls below the noise. The noise gets lower. Well, the noise stays constant, I should say. The power gets higher. The signal to noise ratio gets better. And so you kind of see this flat to slightly downward trajectory. And then all of a sudden it shoots up. And that point at which it starts to shoot up, which kind of looks like a knee, is a way of visually seeing that the amp is starting to overload, basically, that it's starting to hit its limits. And so we call that clipping. And, technically clipping would be seen as a squaring off, for instance, of the edges of the sound wave. But that all of this is a very difficult way to do it. And this knee is just a really easy way to see it. So if you define the point at which it clips is the knee, which is a very conservative way of doing it, because we're talking about distortion levels that were well under 0.0, let's see, 005, I think it looks like it was roughly, then it was about 120 watts. But if we define it as 0.1%, it's actually which is a common one, that's actually closer to 175 watts. In the 8 ohms, 2 channels driven. That's pretty good. And in fact, looking at 4 ohms, what we saw was the noise performance and distortion was only slightly worse. Some of that actually was my analyzer. I think it really is only slightly worse. And the knee lies at around 250 watts at 0.01% and around 300 watts at 0.1%. So again, that's pretty good. It can't do that into 7+ channels, but it's very rare that you'd ever be asking this thing to pump out that much power into all 7 channels. So the fact that it can do it to 2 channels is pretty good. And I did have both channels loaded, and I was sending the same signal to both channels for this particular test. So even though I'm only showing one channel, the left channel, both were being driven to make sure that this was the 2 channels driven power spec. So I did go ahead and load this thing up. And actually, the backstory on this is that when I put 7 channels on it, and I put it in to kind of test everything, I tried to bump 7 channels through it and then have it come out. It wasn't really working quite right the way I was expecting it to. So I did a comparison of pure direct versus not, where I used a 7-channel mono signal into the HDMI input to make it do this so that I could get it working properly. And I blew the amp. And to be very fair, part of how I blew the amp was I was talking to Gina on the phone, and I was incrementing up an output level to try to see what it could do. And I think I incremented a little too much. And I did have more than 7 channels driven actually at this point. So I said 7. I actually was sending like an all channels driven type of thing, but only had some of the channels loaded. And at this point, I think I had 10 channels loaded up. So you got to remember, this is like a brutal test you would never actually do. No musical signal would ever look like this. This was a 1 kilohertz sine wave at full power blasting right into that receiver. And I just turned it up too high and then just burst that tone right into it. And that was it. Sent a new one. We're finishing up the review with the new one, which is, what I'm doing here. And I redid this test and I got the same basic results. So it's fine. I just didn't do that really, really brutal one. I was more careful. But basically, it appears that I said the AD converter is noisy. I don't know that it's the AD converter, actually. I think that in pure direct, it's much cleaner in this particular scenario. With HDMI input, it wasn't as much, but with the analog input, it was. And the way that I did this, like I said, with the HDMI wasn't working right. And so I ended up doing it instead using the analog input and then doing all channels stereo on the receiver, which just copies the signal across all the channels. And then I drove a left and the right identical signal into the receiver analog in and connected to it. And so anyway, basically this thing put out pretty darn close to 100 watts with 7 channels driven. I would say the knee is at around 90 watts, but it's 0.1% at 100 watts. So the fact that this thing could do 100 watts, 7 channels driven like that is pretty good. I looked at the line level performance in for frequency response, and I looked at it in pure direct versus not pure direct, and sent in a 96 kilohertz signal. And what you can see, sampling rate signal, I should say. And what you can see is that when it's in pure direct mode, it's basically flat out to very high. It rolls off very subtly, and there's no out of band noise issues that you can see, given the bandwidth limits of the analyzer I'm using. If you do turn pure direct off, and that limits it then to, I think it looks like about 48 kilohertz, you see a pretty sharp roll off at around 22 kilohertz or so. And then there's a lot of out of band noise, and I don't actually know for sure what the cause of that is. And I don't know that it's anything wrong with the Sony. It could be my analyzer. There was a bunch of things that were showing kind of weird out of band noise when the response dropped a lot. That might have been something with the analyzer. Point is, you can see though that in the higher sampling rate, pure direct mode, it's cleaner than it is in the standard mode, and that standard, not pure direct mode, seems to be introducing we'll say 48 kilohertz upper limit. So, roughly speaking, 22 to 24 kilohertz actual frequency bandwidth limit. So then I switched over to line level performance and stopped measuring the amplifier. And I looked at the 1 kilohertz HDMI in to line out performance, and I actually got much better SYNAD, 89.3. But and the signal to noise ratio with this 2 volt output was 95.4 dB. So way better. But keep in mind something. There are 2 good HDMI inputs, and then the other 5 are not. So when I measured it, the other 5 gave me the same performance as the amplifier. But when I measured through those 2 good ones, one is the SACD 4K input and one is the Blu-ray 8K input, I got this almost 90 dB SYNAD. The signal is distortion dominated here, and it's primarily third harmonic. And these measurements were all done A-weighted again. I did an unweighted measurement and actually saw the same, roughly speaking, 94 dB. And then the SYNAD was 90.7 dB this time. Again, like trying to capture this, it would change. We're talking about a fraction of a decibel. It would change, and I'd have to like hit kind of stop and then save it and capture the image of it. And so I didn't always capture exactly the best number I ever saw. But I would just say probably what that means is that the A weighting isn't really improving things any, that the noise and distortion falls within that audible band range more than the A weighting would offset. And that it's probably a 90 dB SYNAD. Like, if I did this enough times over and over again, I'd probably get that value enough to capture it and show you. And as I did in this unweighted one. I did look at the bass management. I set it to 80 hertz, and I looked to see if we were getting the crossover points where you'd expect them to be. The answer is yes. And I looked to see if it was rolling off at the rate that you would expect. And the answer again is yes. So the performance is what it should be. So what can we conclude from these measurements? Well, the preamp section and looking at the FFT shows that I think it's above average performance compared to just all receivers on the market. But it is not state of the art, and it is not as good as it possibly gets. There certainly are better products. However, all of the products that are current, that are on the market that are better, are only a little bit better. There are some older, high-end Denon receivers, which I believe have had SYNAD values in excess of 100. This didn't have that. I get it, but 90 is pretty good. I mean, it's really not bad. It doesn't, as I said, doesn't reach the levels of the very best products on the market, but I think the value is good enough for the average person. And I think that it's got so many good features that you should consider this based on it being acceptable for your use case with features you need. The frequency response looks very typical for a product like this. I don't have any issues with that. And the amplifier section is powerful. It equaled or exceeded the competition in a lot of ways. So I was impressed with that amplifier, actually. And I think it's generally a good set of measurements. I know as a flagship receiver, some of you would want to see better yet, and I get it. But I really think that when you consider where this thing would be most likely used, it really wouldn't matter. Very few people have very quiet, dedicated home theaters with very, very low noise floors. I've actually, kind of getting to an aside here, even the best processors made have hiss. And so I've had systems set up with the Trinov, which has a SYNAD value that is around 100 on the old DACs and actually exceeds 100 on the new DACs, hooked into amplifiers that are made by companies like Hypex and Purify that are among the quietest out there in rooms, and had people tell me that they don't hear any hiss. I've taken that same setup, including in my own house, and put that into a much quieter room, and all of a sudden there's very audible hiss. The hiss didn't actually change. The hiss was the exact same level as it was in both scenarios. The difference was the noise floor. The noise floor masked the hiss in the other rooms because it was just a normal room. It wasn't a special dedicated room that was very quiet. And then in the case of like my house, the noise floor is actually very low. The dBA number that I get, so not even the NC number, is below 20. The NC number is actually below 15. And all of that is at the limits of my microphones. I don't have a microphone that can measure any lower than that. So basically, we're talking about a really, really quiet room allows you to hear hiss. Normal rooms, you don't. When the SYNAD value is like 90, you are going to hear hiss probably in an extremely quiet room. But you're not going to hear hiss in a typical room. It's just not even close, in fact. And you're not going to hear that distortion. It'll be masked by the normal noises of the room. And that's true of just any normal living room. So I think that when you consider it that way, this thing measures good enough to be really a decent product. And then, as I said, it's got a lot of problem solver features like that center channel lift that I think could be really useful for a lot of people. So overall, I think the Sony has a compelling set of measurements, good feature set. I've only used it to power a pair of speakers. And so I can tell you that the amplifier sounds powerful. And it was better than another amp I was using that was rated at 80 watts that I think was not as good of an 80 watt amp as this is as a, say, 140 watt amp. And the only reason I haven't used it in a full surround system is that my system is on a Control 4. And so you can't just insert a new product. So I'm just waiting for Don's guys to come over and help me out. They're going to install that for me. And then we'll redo this video, basically kind of come back and just talk about some of those features and how they work. So consider this more of an initial review, overview, and measurement set. Now, in terms of build quality and looks, I've had a good amount of time to go through it. I actually have on hand top of the line Marantz processor. Almost top line, second to top line, AV7706. And it's kind of a similar price point. And I have some other products like that in that price point. What I can tell you is the build quality on this is similar. There's been a move recently to get away from a lot of use of aluminum and use more plastic that looks like aluminum. While that seems like a downgrade, and it probably is a cost savings, it looks good. I don't actually have an issue with the looks. And the product is pretty heavy duty and well built anyway. The binding posts are not the nicest I've ever seen on an amplifier, but amongst receivers are pretty good and I think are fine for this grade of product. Overall, I think that this is a good receiver design. I think it actually has a very nice, clean, modern look. A lot of receivers have a panel on the front that flips down. This one actually you remove it completely to access all the extra features and buttons that normally you would access through the remote. And I kind of like that because it gives it a really clean, minimalist look. It's really my preference. It's got a beefy power supply, big transformer, nice big capacitors. And then they have something else, which is a Sony proprietary feature, and that is the Sony 360 Reality Audio. It's a proprietary object-based surround format, and they have a note, and I think this note is important. To access and make use of this, 360 Reality Audio requires a subscription to compatible online music service, and third-party terms and conditions and account fees may apply. What does that mean? Well, it means you need to use a streaming service that has that. I'm not 100% sure all of them, so I'm not even going to try to tell you which one those are. I know Tidal has that, and I have Tidal, and so I do plan to try this out. My understanding is that Sony did this because they were really looking for a way to kind of control the spatial audio process for music better. And so I believe this is really a music thing more than anything else. And so this is a really, I think, cool feature, and that I've used the headphone version and I really thought that it worked pretty well compared to the others. I liked it better than Dolby. So I think that this will be neat to try out and see how it works. All right. Now, the last thing I'll just mention is, how does it compare in price to others? Well, it's roughly a $3,300 receiver. I think it's $3,299.99. And that's basically the selling price for it. And so, that actually puts it below the upper end of the Denon receiver. The Denon's top line receiver is more expensive than that, but it does have more power. It does measure a little bit better, has more features, and more channels. So, that receiver is like the Denon flagship is a higher level than the Sony. This thing really compares to the step down in the Denon lineup. There is an equivalent Marantz that it compares with and an equivalent Yamaha. And I think within that, it's comparably priced. I think where people are going to take issue maybe with it, as I said, doesn't have the absolute best measurements. I think they're fine. I don't really have an issue with them, but I understand that some would. And then the other thing is, it doesn't have Dirac. It's got a proprietary Sony room correction system. It doesn't have Odyssey. Now, remember, Yamaha has YPAO. I've never had very good results with that. I don't happen to think that's particularly a great one. And so the Sony in the past, I hadn't really liked either. This is a new version, and I'm really interested to try it out and see how it works. So I am going to be giving that a test, and we're going to see how that works out. And if it does provide good correction, then maybe we could start recommending it along with some of the others. And if it doesn't, that would be too bad. I mean, that would be one of the reasons maybe not to get this, is that you're not getting great features for improving sound. At a bare minimum, you typically want to be able to apply at least some PEQ to the bass. I think there's a lot of argument to be made for not touching anything else, but getting the levels right, which it does do, getting the delays right, which it can do, and then also doing something to correct the bass and kind of just apply a general room curve to the response. I think is kind of necessary. And if it can't do that, as I said, that would be disappointing. So we're going to test that. We'll see how it does. And, hopefully it works well. So there you have it. That's my review of the Sony STR-AZ7000ES. I hope you found this video informative. And, until next time, keep listening.